Hello and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with me, Francis Matthew, and my friend Eddie O'Sullivan. And we wish Ramadan Kareem to those of you who are celebrating this month just starting now. First, we'll take a look at the headlines.
In This Week in the Middle East, hopes have been dashed that a Gaza ceasefire would be announced at the start of the holy month of Ramadan. President Biden has promised to build a temporary pier to supply Gaza. 3 key Libyan leaders have agreed on the necessity of forming a new unified government that would supervise long-delayed elections. Turkish President Erdogan has said that local elections on the 31st of March will be the last vote where he will lead the ruling AKP party, and Saudi Arabia's Aramco raised its dividend despite recording a 25% profit fall on lower oil prices and sales in 2023.
No peace in Gaza, no ceasefire, and the Americans are talking of building a pier. To discuss this, let's bring Eddie. Eddie, hello.
Hello, Francis.
Welcome. Your main headline there was the American plan to build a kind of temporary harbour in Gaza. It seems way out of order. And David Cameron, UK Foreign Secretary, was saying, why don't they open Ashdod and do it from there?
Well, he's asked a very good question, because it'll take at least 2 months for this pier to be built. And we have got a situation where 2 months to build it. I mean, that's what the figure is, 2 months, 6 weeks, something like that. You have to design it, build it. You can't just, so to get it operating, to take the volumes that's required. So in that period, when you've got a humanitarian crisis, which is extended to starvation, where people are dying by the day, I mean, that is obviously inadequate response. And so David Cameron's suggestion is, why don't they open Ashdod? Exactly. Why don't the Israelis let the stuff in? Very good question. But unfortunately, because we haven't got a positive answer to that, you can only assume that this situation is going to continue, Francis.
But it seems to me it's a bit of a nonsense, because you've got, I mean, the lorries are there. All they have to do is go through, and then one can argue about the distribution inside. And so to be going through this elaborate nonsense of either, I mean, was it last 2 weeks ago they were flying it in and parachuting them down onto the beach to great confusion. And now again, another workaround. And yet it's just a failure to get the Israelis or the Egyptians to let the stuff through.
Well, I think the Egyptians would again argue that it's not their responsibility. They are cooperating with a government with which they have full diplomatic relations, and which controls the border. I mean, the Israelis control it, and they are adhering to the requests of the Israeli government. It's a bit like, you might argue, the border between France and Germany, that if the German government says to France, we want you to stop certain things on your side of the border, I think the French government would cooperate. And they wouldn't definitely immediately say no. And that's where we are. It's a deliberate decision not to let the aid in. And it's pretty clear. And I think it's unambiguous, actually. The intention is to continue collective punishment of Gaza until such time as the military objectives or that the IDF have set, which is destruction of Hamas as a military force, is completed. But nobody believes that's achievable. So it doesn't add up as a coherent policy. It just seems like total cruelty.
And Netanyahu has yet to define his sort of end game to say, this is all he said is total destruction of Hamas, which is, as many in Israel and others say, is completely impossible. So as an end game, he doesn't have a line which he can cross and say, we've now stopped. And the discussions going on about the hostages are also running into the sand. So it looks as though it's just going to trickle on for a long time. And at some time, whether it's during Ramadan or not, I don't think it makes much difference to Israelis. They will go into Rafah and cause all sorts of chaos.
Well, I think I think you can't predict that much detail, because there was talk about the attack on Rafah had been going on for at least 2 months. The situation is, it's not so much like what will possibly happen, is what won't happen. And we're in a situation where people seem to be immobilized politically at every level. And what won't happen in those circumstances is that the blockade and the continuing abuse of Gaza will continue until someone stops it. Who's going to stop it? That's the question. Who's going to say this must now stop? And there doesn't seem to be anybody in that position.
No, the only person the only person possible is Biden and the Americans, who's big enough to actually do something if they want to, but he doesn't look as they're ready to do it. So the outlook is that it will not stop, and therefore Netanyahu doesn't seem to be willing to listen to anybody. And also politically and domestically, he has got himself strung out along this single road where he has to keep the fighting going in order to maintain his own tenuous hold on the coalition he's cobbled together.
Yes, exactly. The only thing that can stop this, if there is a crisis in the coalition government which would precipitate fresh elections in Israel prematurely, and who's going to bring that about? And do they think they're going to benefit from it? If whoever precipitates it, do they think they're going to benefit from it? I don't think anybody feels they will precipitate the end of the coalition.
Well, it's very difficult to see how that would happen, because Benny Gantz has gone in bringing extra numbers into the wartime coalition. He can leave, but it still leaves Netanyahu with the original coalition, backed by the two radical members of his cabinet who are going all the way and very happy to see the settlements increase, and possibly they're talking of taking over Gaza, they're talking of expelling the Palestinians, and all sorts of very far-right ideas.
Yes, the break point that you can see in 2024, and I think I forecast that 2024 is going to be a bad year for the world. The break point that you can see that could change things is the presidential election in November. And that's quite a long time to wait.
Long time.
And the question there is, of course, if Trump wins, then is there any reason to believe that American policy would change? I don't think so. There's no evidence that he's any less beholden to people with an agenda than Biden is. So the possible breakpoint is, and this is what people openly speculate, is that if Biden's health degenerates to such an extent, they has to step aside, and they come up with a younger candidate, more appealing, who can mobilize the anti-Trump vote, and that personality might be more. And if they win on that basis by not being Trump, if they are an alternative to Biden wins, but for not being Trump, that in itself is quite a big mandate to do things.
But that's all a very long way. It's a very long way in the future for the poor people suffering in millions in Gaza, and it's a whole. If it happens, one can construct that, but it's going to be on the way there. There's months and months of misery and blockade continuing.
Well, I think the thing is, forearmed is forewarned. If you know what's coming, and don't delude yourself into thinking that there's some happy short-term, that a white horse with someone that's going to ride over the horizon and stop it all. I think for the audiences in Britain, at least, I think that people are upset by the television images rather than the reality. And I think if the television images weren't there, a lot of people wouldn't be worried anywhere near as much about it as they are. But of course, the television images will continue so long as the facts are as they are. And but I think you have to inure yourself to the fact that this is going to go on for months, and we will see. And starvation is quite a slow process, unfortunately.
And the UN is talking of actual starvation. I mean, it's staggering, man-made starvation.
Well, it's happened before. It starts slowly. First of all, it hits the most vulnerable, the young, the sick, the old, and then you gradually, and they are getting food. So you'll be able to, enterprising people. So the starvation process won't reach the kind of, mounds of dead that would be enough, I think, to trigger some kind of emergency action. So Anyway, a horrible thing to talk about as we sit here comfortably contemplating our suppers. The terrible situation, but I feel we must inure ourselves and prepare ourselves for this thing to go on for months more.
I think you're right. It's necessary to talk about it so that you're aware of what will be happening over the next few months. Moving southwards from Gaza, down the Red Sea, we have the Houthi who are continuing to attack ships and quite successfully sucking the Americans and their allies, mainly the British, into, although there's another EU force there who are also in action, in my view, quite uselessly, trying to attack the Houthis and weaken them, because the Houthis are quite well set up in the mountains, and some aerial bombardment isn't going to shake them very easily. So I think there's a danger that the US is getting sucked into sort of supporting the attack on a group who are apparently defending the Palestinians. So it's getting the US into a very strange position politically.
Well, right, there you are. There's a number of fronts, and people have been speculating continuously about the Yemeni front, the Lebanese front, and then it goes on. And that sense of potential crisis will keep us going for months until something breaks it, which is logically the US election and new administration that's coming in and wants to do something differently. So I think all these things will continue, Francis. I'd like to refer, actually, now we're talking about broader issues, to an interesting article that I read in Foreign Affairs this week, and it's written by Greg Karlstrom, who is the a Middle East correspondent for The Economist, so a mainstream journalist. It's called The Power Vacuum in the Middle East, and I think it's quite an interesting insight into the thinking of the liberal, of the liberal West about how they're approaching it. Because what he says, the article's called The Power Vacuum in the Middle East, and he says that the problem in the Middle East isn't so much the Houthis or whatever it is that no one's in charge of the Middle East anymore. America is resigning, doesn't have any influence on Israel. The Russians are preoccupied with Syria. The Chinese, wisely, are refusing to get vectored into the quagmire. So you've got a vacuum and nobody's running it, which is an extraordinary thing for anybody to say, because it denies the agency of the people and countries of the region itself. You've got Israel, God bless them, they're doing their own thing. They've got agency. Egypt's the most populous country in the Arab world, 100 million people. You've got the Gulf states, the Gulf states have got more oil and gas than anywhere else on the planet, and the Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi, and UAE got more financial wealth than any government in the world. And then you have Iran with massive gas resources. You have Turkey. So why would anybody who claims to be an expert on Middle East affairs say, if America's not involved and Russia's not involved and China's not involved, then there's a state of chaos? No, there's not. What there is the potential, if this can be encouraged, for the countries of the region, the peoples of the region, to start working multilaterally and bilaterally together without outside powers sticking their fingers in. I was going to say that seems to be the view. It seems to be the view, the Western view, the Washington view, and to an extent in Britain. I mean, we still feel that we should have an empire. If we haven't, we should be allied with the global power, that we must impose or intervene in areas and try and bring peace, light, and the American way. When in fact, the countries themselves, surely it's the responsibility of the government themselves to sort out their own domestic affairs and build proper relations among each other. And I think if there is any way through this mess long term, it's through that, not through any magic formula, not through any American president arriving on a horse or some brilliant visionary guru from the outside. It's going to come from practical constructive leadership in the countries in the Middle East.
No, definitely. I mean, I think Arab problems have an Arab solution, and the answer lies in the Middle East. I wouldn't start looking to capitals around the great powers. I would be looking locally. And Egypt, a former very significant leader, suffered badly. I mean, at the moment, I would say that the Sisi government is not a very good leader for the Middle East. It's in hock and making all sorts of mistakes. Syria and Iraq to old leaders who did a good job in the past of being the dominant force in the Arab world, collapsed decades ago. So you're left with the Saudis who are feeling their way into it. And so I would say the leadership for any initiative comes from Saudi Arabia, and they've stepped up to the plate. They're working with Egypt and the Emirates to try and create some kind of nexus, which is giving a way forward.
Yes. And of course, unpalatable as it is, and as how revolting the concept is to Washington and the United States, and probably Brussels too, Iran, inescapably, country almost 100 million people. I mean, you cannot exclude it. You cannot exclude it from what the future is.
Exactly, I think that's exactly why Saudi Arabia, before October the 7th, was working to have a working relationship with Iran. And many of the Gulf states have had one for decades. So you're right. Iran, though, is not going to be a leader of the Arab side. It's going to be a dominant force, but it needs to be worked with rather than against.
Sure. But obviously, its role is not so much of its Arab character, excuse me, its Arab character or its Muslim character. It's the fact that this is their region. It's their backyard. Yes. That's the reason. And I think the less we talk about, Shia Crescent and all this nonsense that was invented in Washington by American think tanks, that we're less talk we have on that, and just simply what are the material interests of the people of the region, then the more happier place we're going to be in.
Well, the Gulf states have always been quite clear that it's not called the Persian Gulf. They call it the Arabian Gulf for very good reason. And looking in the other direction from there, they are also, I mean, it's an interesting thing which caught my eye, that the Emirates has been working with Ethiopia, two new partners in BRICS, which you mentioned a few episodes ago. Ethiopia, the great economic power of the Horn of Africa, and which is, we normally dismiss that whole area as an area of chaos, Somaliland, Somalia, a civil war in Yemen, and say that it's all too much to handle. But the Emirates has done an interesting thing. It worked with the government of Ethiopia to try and get access to Berbera, the port in Djibouti. That failed. And so they have then done a negotiation. The Emirates led a negotiation with Ethiopia and the breakaway state of Somaliland on the borders of Djibouti, where the UAE has a port manages in Berbera. And they have used their influence to help give Ethiopia a deal which has 20 kilometers of port, a coast in which they can build a port. So Ethiopia is delighted to have access to the sea and access to what it will build as a port. But this has absolutely infuriated whatever you might call the government in Somalia, where in Mogadishu, far to the south, who have not had any control over Somaliland in the north for some decades.
Yeah, Somalia is another creation, a result of European colonial intervention. And it was cobbled together, of course, Somalia, what was once called Italian Somalia land and British Somaliland. And those divisions still remain. So the north, which is granting the port access to Ethiopia, is Somaliland. And the high proportion is quite Anglophilic. You probably met people from Somaliland who were residents in UAE, and I certainly used to do it quite a lot. And you met them, they spoke perfect English, and their whole attitude was very Anglophilic and Western oriented. Whereas the South, which was previously more Italian dominated, is where actually the stronger Islamic influence is. And correct. There is a lot of rivalry there. And we see this actually in the streets of North London, where I live, believe it or not. There's a very large Somali community just around the corner from me. And they're asylum seekers, essentially, and they came over. And you discover when you meet them that there is a real cleavage between the Somaliland people and the people from the South, which extends, of course, it's a family connection as well, cultural connection. and they are, you know, there is a real just below the surface tension between the two. But anyway, this area that's been used, yeah, the UAE, this looks like a more pragmatic rather than ideological approach to Ethiopia. It's coming up with a solution that is, because Ethiopia effectively, because Eritrea was stripped out, became landlocked.
Yes.
They had no access to the sea. So giving them a port, which is going to be good for trade, a secure port, this looks like a very pragmatic approach to try and help the largest, most populous country in the Horn of Africa to find some economic future and therefore help promote stability. And we will hope amity amongst the peoples of the Horn of Africa, that where the chaos has reigned since the 1970s.
That's the idea, and I agree. It's a pragmatic answer. Whether they then have to get on and actually do it and work with them, because there's been so many border disputes and quarrels there that it's highly feasible. It could collapse yet again. But
well, I suspect the UAE not inclined to take steps like this that don't have a practical implication. I think they would have studied it, done the work, got the researchers in, they got the port management capability in the UAE, and I think it's very practical. When it will take place is another thing. You can't build a port overnight, not a big one anyway. It takes years.
No, I mean, this is as big as Kaizad and Abu Dhabi. It's a 20-kilometer stretch of coast. Interestingly, though, it's between Berbera, which is in Somaliland, as you say, the former British territory, which is now its own, and it's had its own elections in some time, and the breakaway part of Somalia called Puntland, which is the tip of the of the Horn of Africa, two old sultanates which were there in the 16th and 17th century, and they have now got a separate port called Bosaso, where again DP World is managing that port for them. So it looks as though DP World will probably be helping on 3 ports along that coast, on facing up to Aden.
Yes, one of the things that that people don't realize is that the straits between Arabia and the Horn of Africa were constant flow of people and trade and goods that went over for generations and hundreds of years. And so there is a natural connection between the two parts, between, you know, Southwest Arabia, Aden and other places, and these territories. And so it would be wonderful if the ideological and political rivalries were set aside, and that everyone recognized that it's to everybody's good that there should be more trade, more exchanges of goods and people between Arabia and the Horn of Africa, promoting wealth and social political understanding. And that would be a wonderful thing.
I think that's what, in fact, Anwar Gagash of the UAE said, this is part of what we're trying to do with our port knowledge. Well,
that's great, because that was in many respects the message that came through UAE when I was there and we were there, which is that they put trade and commerce before ideology. And then we had, of course, with the chain with the Yemeni situation, the Houthis, that suddenly the UAE became started thinking in another way as a military force, and rather than thinking as the UAE had tended to do, which is we don't really care, you know, what your ideological arguments are. We'll do trade, we'll do business if there's profit for both of us. So maybe that we're reverting more to that kind of pragmatic, trade-oriented foreign policy for the region, which I think has done the UAE a huge amount of good, and I think will do a huge amount of good for everybody involved in the future.
Well, I can plunge into a memory of the troubles in Somalia started a very long time ago, and I was the editor of Gulf News, and various Somali groups came in to see me, shouting I'd been rude about this group, rude about that group, I don't know what group, all over, and endless teams of Somalis came to shout at me.
So how did you resolve that one, Francis? Did you just shut the door?
I called our friend Ibrahim Al-Abid in the what was then the Ministry of Information, and I said to him, who does the UAE recognize, and who should the UAE newspaper recognize as the government of Somalia? And Ibrahim gave me this great, he said, we recognize all of them, and whoever turns up at the embassy buildings, we just give them the keys, because we pay the electricity and we pay the water, so they have to work it out, and we recognize everybody.
Well, isn't that a marvelous piece of wisdom there? And
Yes.
Ibrahim Al-Abed, who's long, really deeply missed, wonderful man,
Wonderful guy.
who incredible capability and such insightfulness. But that is just such a beautiful Ibrahim Al-Abed comment, and I think that reflects the truth. And wouldn't it be great, wouldn't it? Don't you think that instead of governments having these hard policies, they have policies and red lines that define it. This flexible attitude, very Arabian, very pragmatic. Yes. Behave yourself, treat me with respect and I'll treat you with respect. And we don't have to agree about anything else.
And 30 years later, we've got the UAE building ports all around that region. Yeah, so with that happy thought, Eddie, I think we shall pause at this stage and say thank you very much.
Francis, it's a joy as ever. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Brilliant. And with that, we close. Now, we've said a few things. I hope you've got some comments. I hope you will come into us and tell us whether you agree with us or whether you don't. And thank you very much for listening. I wish you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.